Hi, I'm Rebecca Larson, and I am the owner of TudorsDynasty.com and the host of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Researching and telling the stories of those who lived in 16th century England is my passion, and I honestly love sharing with you all of the things that I find. This is where you can find me. One of the things that I really enjoy sharing with you are my stories of Thomas Seymour. Now, people often ask me what piqued my interest in Thomas Seymour, and that is really a difficult question to answer. It really was a culmination of things that led me to him, and once I found him, I found a bit of myself. And so often as history lovers, I think we find a person who we identify with, whether we realize it or not. And I truly believe that the reason that happens is because we find a bit of ourselves in that person, which makes us more sympathetic to their cause. And Thomas Seymour is that person for me. So now I want to do a little exercise with you. Excuse me while I look away at my other monitor to get this set up. Let's do a little exercise. I want you to take a moment right now and think about which character in Tudor history you feel akin to and why. And if there isn't one, that's okay too. You just haven't found that person yet. But I want you to message me. Write it down right now. You write down who it is that you feel akin to, who you feel that bond with. Write it down and message me afterwards, whether it's on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, email me, Rebecca@tudorsdynasty.com. I really am curious to find out who it is that you feel that connection with, like I do. So anyway, as I mentioned previously, I am sympathetic to Thomas Seymour because I can relate to the experiences he had. Being a younger sibling myself, striving to be noticed, having rumors spread about me, and that feeling of being dismissed by people. It's that feeling that drives a person. And it drove Thomas Seymour to fight for what he saw was rightfully his. So, who was Thomas Seymour? Really, who was he? Well, most everyone knows that he was the third surviving son of Sir John Seymour of Wolf Hall and Marjorie Wentworth. That he was brother of Queen Consort Jane Seymour and brother to Edward Seymour, later Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector. And his sister Elizabeth married Thomas Cromwell's son, Gregory. So he was well connected, related to the king through marriage. But generally speaking, Thomas's post-mortem reputation does not give an accurate account of the man. I'm disappearing, sorry. We often hear that Thomas Seymour was cruel to his wife, Catherine Parr, that he molested the Lady Mary, that he killed the king's dog. There's one thing that is most often overlooked by historians and writers alike, and that is that Thomas was a loyal servant to the king. So let's begin by looking at Thomas's service to King Henry. The first evidence of Thomas at the court of Henry VIII pops up in 1530 as a servant to his cousin, Sir Francis Bryan. You've probably heard this before. When Bryan was an ambassador to France at the time, and it was Thomas's duty to deliver letters back and forth between Francis Bryan and the king. Now, 2 years later, in 1532, we see Thomas receiving his first grant from the king. So even before his sister caught the eye of King Henry, Thomas had already begun to make way for himself at court. Likely that had something to do with his brother's relationship with the king and Thomas's connection to Sir Francis Bryan. Now, we don't know if Thomas was involved in the rise of his sister. There just isn't any evidence to suggest it. But something interesting has come to light recently, thanks to historian Graham Bath, who has now changed the death date of Sir John Seymour. Interestingly enough, it has always been December of 1536, after Jane was already queen. Graham Bath has found information that leads him to believe that Sir John Seymour was actually dead in December of 1535. So think about that for a second. December 1535. Anne Boleyn is still on the throne, right? Jane isn't queen yet. There hasn't been an execution. So who is driving Jane at that point? That's what we don't know for certain. I'd like to say it was Edward Seymour, but I don't know. I just want to say that to poke Janet's buttons. But one of the things that we do know for sure happened was that after Thomas's nephew was born, Prince Edward, that he was knighted. So 1537, he became Sir Thomas. And he was also appointed gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Now, if you don't know, the gentleman of the Privy Chamber position was actually created by Henry VIII in 1518. Okay, so it had been around for almost 2 decades at this point. So it had been a while since he had had these gentlemen close to him. If Henry VIII's early years as king are any indication, we know that these guys that he had surrounding him were his bosom buddies, so to speak, his chums, his pals, his partners in crime. Well, then it should come to as no surprise to you that those men that he had brought in after the creation were soon after dismissed by Cardinal Wolsey for inappropriate familiarity with the king, and then something about dishonorable behavior on their last embassy to France. Those men included Edward Neville, Nicholas Carew, Francis Bryan, among others. Now, the men were sent away from court for a brief time. Some of them came back. Now, this just suggests that Wolsey feared the influence of those men being so near the king. And now here we have Thomas in the same role, near the king. So it gives you a little idea of what kind of relationship he probably had with Henry VIII at that time. Anyway, there were some sketchy characters around Henry VIII, so you can't blame Wolsey too much, because I found a letter that Sir Francis Bryan wrote to Arthur Plantagenet, who, by the way, was the son of King Edward IV, and by way was uncle to Henry VIII. Now, in the letter, he says, this cracks me up, I perceive that in Calais ye have sufficient courtesans to furnish and accomplish my desires. Isn't that just how you expect Sir Francis Bryan to be? But maybe that had something to do with why Cromwell called him Vicar of Hell. I think all the men around him in Henry's healthier, more active years were really the men whose company Henry enjoyed. So for Thomas to be named to his privy chamber, he's the brother-in-law to the king, uncle to the future king. Thomas really couldn't get any closer to Henry than that. Well, okay, I guess unless he was the groom of the stool, which I don't know why anyone, no matter what it got you, would want that position. I truly believe that Thomas's position as gentleman of the Privy Chamber allowed him further advancement. Now, not only was his nephew, the future king, born in 1537, but that is also when Thomas's naval career began to soar. He became captain of the sweepstake. And at that same time, he was also named Joint Master Steward of both Chirk and Holt castles. Around Easter of 1538, we get a little bit of insight into Thomas's character. Now, this is at a time when Thomas really had the ear of the king, and he reported to King Henry that he believed Archbishop Cranmer was misusing his income. Those are pretty big charges. But then Thomas realized he was mistaken and retracted on learning his information was wrong. So it seems that Thomas jumped to a conclusion, likely wanting to prove to the king his loyalty. But when he realized that he had made a mistake, he owned up to it. Even that didn't change his trajectory. Not long after that event, there was a marriage alliance with the Howard family that came into play. Now, this was suggested by the Duke of Norfolk. Okay, let's get you a little picture here so you can see all of the players, if I can figure out what I'm doing here. All the players involved in this, okay? So, the Duke of Norfolk suggested that Thomas marry his widowed daughter, Mary, Duchess of Richmond. Now, Mary was the widow of Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. So by marriage, both she and Tom were related to the king. Think about that for a minute. Now, Mary's father, Thomas Howard, saw the marriage as a wise one since Thomas was uncle to the future king. He had the king's ear, and forget that he was the only unwed Seymour left at court. It also solved an issue for Norfolk because he was trying to obtain his daughter's jointure from the king. Fortunately, nothing came of the talk, and the subject was dropped for at least a few years, until again when Norfolk proposed the idea and nothing happened. What else do we know about Thomas? Well, we see him traveling to France as a member of Sir Anthony Browne's embassy in 1538. Then the following year, we can place him in Calais to take part in welcoming Anne of Cleves. As this goes on, you should really visibly be seeing Thomas Seymour's star just beginning to rise. All of these things that he's accomplished in the 8 years he's already been at court. He really was one of the most loyal subjects of King Henry. The king trusted Thomas with affairs of state as an ambassador. He was trusted as master of ordnance and filled in as the head of the English army for a short time. He was trusted vice admiral and lord admiral. And when it came to politics and military, Thomas really was the guy. Well, of course, after his brother Edward, because Edward was older. The king and Cromwell even favored Thomas so much as giving him property. He gained nearly 40 pieces during the dissolution of the monasteries and after. We can also learn a bit about Thomas as well by the people he surrounded himself with. Now we can get a little insight into Thomas's experience with the Knight of the Garter, okay? Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey, clearly wanted to stay on friendly terms with Thomas after they had tried to arrange the marriage with Mary with Thomas. But when it comes to the Knight of the Garter, one would have to be voted on by people who were already members. It really came out to be almost a popularity contest, and then the king would make final approval. So we see in the records that Thomas was nominated in 1543, which, by the way, was after Henry VIII had already married Catherine Parr. Now, those members at the time who voted for him this first time were William Parr, Earl of Essex, who was Catherine Parr's brother. Then we have John Dudley, Viscount Lisle. We know who he is, right? Okay, he later Duke of Northumberland. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, there we go again, and Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. So he's got a pretty decent following at this point. He's got his allies, his alliances are pretty decent at this point. But unfortunately, in 1543, he didn't receive the majority vote. Now, the next year, 1544, once again, he was nominated. This time he was nominated by William Parr, Earl of Essex, and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. I'm not sure what was going on in 1544, but we don't have all the people before that had voted for him. But once again, anyway, he didn't get majority vote and would have to wait for another time. Now, the following year, in 1545, this is when Thomas's popularity really seems to have soared with the number of nominations that he received by some well-known names. Check this out. John Russell, Lord Privy Seal, Henry Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, Edward Seymour, his brother, Earl of Hertford, William Parr, Earl of Essex, Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, and then Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. So he had quite a few alliances in 1545 at this point. And then again, he didn't get a majority, so he wasn't elected. Thomas was again nominated in 1546, which was again the same year that Norfolk brought up the marriage with his daughter Mary again. But neither thing worked out for Thomas. He wasn't inducted, nor was he married to Mary Howard. He didn't get inducted until 1547 under the reign of his nephew, Edward VI. So what happened? Why did the trajectory of Sir Thomas Seymour drop so drastically? Things really began to change for Thomas when on the 23rd of January, 1547, which was, by the way, 5 days before the death of Henry VIII, he was appointed to the Privy Council by the king's command. Again, favor from the king. But later on, we hear a story of John Dudley claiming that the king didn't want Thomas on the council. Why? What benefit would it be to Dudley to make it seem as though the king did not trust or favor Thomas? Seems a little odd. Then again, not long after, we hear of Dudley tricking Thomas into fighting for the governorship, even though Dudley was aware that it had already been claimed by the Duke of Somerset, Thomas's brother. So is he trying to cause division between the brothers? What else could have changed his trajectory? Well, when Thomas secretly married Catherine Parr, it showed some of his new enemies that Thomas was willing to be reckless. He hired lawyers to investigate his right to share power with his brother, which he did. Thomas began to send money to his nephew, the king, paid a servant Fowler to speak to the king on his behalf, and then going so far as to use his nephew to his and Catherine's advantage, since they had secretly married and they desperately needed his approval, or else they'd have to face the Lord Protector and the council. Thomas fought with his brother for Catherine's jewels. He even hired lawyers for that. I'm sure that was annoying. He purchased the wardship of Lady Jane Grey, promised her parents that he would use his power to arrange for her to marry her cousin, the king. They accepted, and he paid a hefty fine. Not a fine, but he paid a hefty amount for her wardship. Now, can you feel the way things are moving here and how things could be perceived? It's interesting to note that there is nothing in Thomas's record that would indicate that he had a poor relationship with his brother prior to Henry VIII's death. Quite to the contrary, I found a letter where Thomas wrote to Edward saying how he had checked in on his sister and that she was well. Sister meaning Edward's wife. So we don't really see much division there. And the fact that we don't hear about them not getting along beforehand kind of speaks volumes to me. It really all began when Edward Seymour claimed all the power for himself. After all, Henry VIII had died, and really the two brothers should have held the power. Was Edward Seymour just making a power move? Really, as the eldest uncle of the future king, he saw this as an opportunity. Who wouldn't? Whether he saw it as an opportunity to protect his nephew or to gain more power, we don't know. What we do know is that Edward Seymour had decided prior to Henry's death that he should be Lord Protector, even though the king's will clearly stated that he did not want one man to hold all the power, that he wanted a regency council of 16 men to guide the young king. Why do you think Henry VIII wanted a regency council instead of making Edward Seymour regent to begin with? Was there something about him that the king didn't like or trust? Why is this never questioned? The previous minor king had been Henry VI. And in that situation, it was his uncles who shared the power. But that also ended with the Wars of the Roses. So prior to Henry VI, it was Richard II, who was ruled by a parliament-selected regency, who, by the way, excluded one of the king's uncles, John of Gaunt. And obviously, he wasn't happy about it either. So Henry did it his own way. In 1540, he had formed his first Privy Council and felt that the group of men had proved an effective executive body to the king. And for this reason, he believed a regency council could be better than, say, a regent. And it didn't take long after Thomas's brother was voted to be Lord Protector and governor of the king's person that there were some men who saw this act as greed on Somerset's part. Just look at all the titles that he had. He was Lord Protector, governor of the king's person, Duke of Somerset, Lord High Treasurer. The list goes on. The imperial ambassador even went so far as to write that Somerset, quotes, governs everything absolutely. He was behaving as a king de facto. Definitely not what Henry VIII wanted. So why all the negative talk about one brother, Thomas, and not the other, Edward? It was said time and time again that people liked Thomas more than Edward, that he was more likable. I think that this was because Thomas was made out to be the enemy, where his brother Somerset was made out to be inefficient, and then later referred to as the good Duke. Why would Somerset wish his brother ill? When it came down to it, he didn't stop the execution. Did he truly perceive his brother as a threat? Were there men surrounding him, whispering in his ear, telling him that he should be worried about his brother? Seems to me there were. By marrying the Dowager Queen without first speaking to his brother, Thomas most definitely caused a rift. It was a slap in the face to his brother, the man who ruled the country, and it likely showed Somerset that his brother would not heed his words. It also shows that Thomas knew that the marriage would not have been approved of, and that is the reason that they went directly to the king. More indirectly to the king, because they used Fowler to do their dirty business. Some have stated even that Catherine Parr expected to be named regent after Henry's death because he named her regent when he went to France. I doubt she expected that. She was a woman. And as effective as she may have been, she was a woman. No man would be ruled by a woman at that time. I do believe Parr's grievances all had to do with her jewels and her standing as the highest ranking woman at court. Thomas agreed with her, and as stated previously, he fought for her right, and it angered his brother over it too. There seems to have been constant bickering between the brothers. Edward would not budge, and in the meantime, there were other men who saw Thomas as a threat to their futures. They had heard whisperings of things that he had spoken to friends. And when we look at contemporary reports of Thomas's downfall and how the narrative was controlled by his enemies, we need not look further than the story of the king's dog. This is where Janet Wortman and I disagree. From my most current research, it seems obvious to me that it is likely that the events at Hampton Court Palace on January 16th, 1549 never happened. Yeah, you heard me right. It's likely it never happened, and that it was just created narrative that was spread by William Paget to the Imperial Ambassador Vanderdelft. I want you to hear a bit of the letter that Vanderdelft wrote to Charles V. Now, this is 9 days after Thomas's arrest, okay? No, 9 days after the alleged Hampton Court Palace event with the dog, 10 days after his arrest. Quote, "Sire, I have heard here that the Admiral of England, with the help of some people about the court, attempted to outrage the person of the young king by night, and has been taken to the Tower. The alarm was given by the gentleman who sleeps in the king's chamber, who, awakened by the barking of the dog that lies before the king's door, cried out, 'Help! Murder!' Everybody rushed in, but the only thing they found was the lifeless corpse of the dog. Suspicion points to the admiral because he had scattered the watch that night on several errands, and because it has been noticed that he has some secret plot on hand, hoping to marry the second daughter of the late king, the Lady Elizabeth, who is under grave suspicion. On my arrival in England, however, I will write the truth more fully to your majesty, having nothing now to go upon beyond the information given by those who repeat common reports." Okay, there's so much there. Notice how it said suspicion points to the admiral. They don't say he was there, we saw him. Just suspicion points to the admiral. And he's also admitting in this letter that what he's repeating is just gossip, or what he believes to be gossip. Now, 3 days later, the emperor writes to Vanderdelft. At this time, he probably hasn't even received Vanderdelft's letter yet. He's just letting him know what he's now heard. So he says, "It's being publicly said here that the Admiral of England made an attempt on the person of the young king, and that he tried to enter his chamber by night at an undue hour, accompanied by armed men, with the intention of killing both the king and the protector, and eventually killing the Lady Mary, our niece, and all of those of royal blood, his end being to make himself king of England." Oh, Lord. Okay, whomever, Paget, was controlling the narrative had done such a great job that even the Emperor Charles V was fed false information. Now, from written contemporary evidence, we know that William Paget often fed Vanderdelft information, so it's completely possible that he was looking to make Tom into the bad guy. Now, we find more evidence about the alleged events at Hampton Court from a man by the name of John Bircher. Now, he was English by birth, but he had exiled himself in Europe for most of his life. Now, he had received letters from his friend Richard Hills in England about the events going on at court. He took that information and then put it in this letter to his friend Henry Bullinger. So this is interesting. He says, the uncle of our king has attempted by an unheard treachery and cruelty to destroy with his own impious hands in the deep silence of the night our innocent king. So he's saying Thomas wanted to kill the king. Okay. He then goes into detail in the story stating he obtained from one of the king's chamberlains, who was privy to his design, a key by means of which there is the nearest access by a door to the royal bedchamber, which he entered dead of the night, accompanied by the accomplices of his crime. There was a space between the door at which he entered and the king's chamber, where the where was lying hid a little dog, the most faithful guardian of the youth, having been accidentally shut out of the chamber. And when he perceived the assassin hurrying towards the king's chamber door, he betrayed the murderer by his barking. This enraged assassin first killed the dog, and had not God prevented, would have killed his master also. I feel like I can't even go on from there. The letter continues, and it's just crazy. The next thing that it mentions is that Thomas was arrested the next morning. Yes, it was the following day that Thomas was arrested. But I can guarantee that it was not for the things mentioned in this letter. Had everything Bircher explains actually happened, would they not have arrested Thomas on the spot if he was standing there holding a smoking gun and the dog is dead? It seems bizarre, right? He says in the letter that Thomas intended to kill the king. Okay, false. Had there been an attempt on the king's life, Thomas would have been charged with regicide. Okay, he wasn't. Plus, the writer of the letter offers far too much detail. Isn't that always a sign of a good lie? It's always, what do they say? The devil's in the detail. In the meantime, there's obviously drama in England, and the French send an envoy to see what's going on because they want to use this to their advantage in Scotland. So remember, at this time, England's fighting with Scotland. France is an ally to Scotland. They want to be able to take advantage of the situation right now. So they're probably hoping on joining up with any opposing faction to cause a civil war in England. You know, whatever they could do. Well, anyway, while all the excitement of interviewing witnesses and making arrests is going on, Tom is locked up in the Tower of London. And we don't know where, unfortunately, but we could possibly hope that it was nicer lodgings for him since he was uncle to the king. Even Thomas More got nicer lodgings, but this is a different monarch. While in the tower, the council would receive constant updates on anything that Thomas would say. His keeper in the tower's name was Christopher Eyre. Now, he would report to the council, as I said, Thomas's mood, anything that he said. So he describes how Thomas went from hopeful to despair when he said he thought that day have heard somewhat from my Lord's grace in the council. Now I see the contrary. So he had hoped that he would have by now heard from his brother and the council. And then he went on to say, and this always gets me here, I had thought before I came to this place that my Lord's grace with all the rest of the council had been my friends, and that I had had as many friends as any man within the realm, but now I think they have forgotten me. Thomas goes on to ask his keeper why he's locked up in the tower. And then he says, I cannot judge myself of an evil thought, never since last Parliament, and I am sure of this, that as concerning the king, there was never a truer knave to his prince than I am, and to all his succession, both my Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth. And as for my lord, my brother, I never meant evil thought of him. And then in the letter, he suddenly remembers, oh, wait, before last Parliament, I thought that I might have the King's Majesty in my custody with the consent of the Lords of the Commons, the Lords and Commons of the Parliament. Okay, so he also says, and to say that ever I went about to take the king from my lord, my brother, by force, I never meant nor thought it. Let me say that again. And to say that ever I went about to take the king from my lord, my brother, by force, I never meant nor thought it. He's saying, okay, there was a time where I wished to have custody of the king. Yes, last Parliament, before last Parliament, that was what I was fighting for. But I was going to do it the right way and the legal way, and I would never do harm to anyone for it. And then he goes on to say that if anyone thought that he did, that he, quote, I will wish no life. But no matter what Thomas said, nobody would listen. He had a right to a trial, but he didn't get one. It was easier to make Thomas out to be the enemy of the state and to carry on destroying his reputation. And after his execution on the 20th of March, 1549, Hugh Latimer did just that. At the behest of the Lord Protector, or at least to appease him, Latimer preached to the king of the lack of morals in his now dead uncle. Nothing like kicking the dog. Nothing like kicking a man when he's down. Really, Thomas is dead. He can't defend himself. And here we have Latimer slandering him. So Latimer preached on how Thomas had been responsible for a woman's death, which there is no evidence. And he also was the one who mentioned the story about the notes to Lady Mary and Lady Elizabeth in the soles of his velvet shoes. He claimed that the letter he wrote was to encourage the women to conspire against the Lord Protector. Now, let's not forget, he just said he didn't want to wish him any harm. Latimer tells this story about Thomas creating these letters out of things on his body. Basically, he was able to write a letter and stick them in the shoes. It's just too far out there for me. There are still so many questions that remain. Did the events of Elizabeth's bedchamber ever occur? Were they made up, just as I suspect that the embrace in the gallery was? And for what reason would Thomas Seymour and Catherine Parr have for cutting Elizabeth's gown into 100 pieces? So much of his story doesn't make sense, and much of it I will visit and explain in my upcoming book. But for now, I'll answer your questions.